numerous parts to apply all possible fixes before restarting the car, the mechanic will not know what exactly caused the problem, and will have an unhappy customer who is charged for unnecessary parts and labor. Instead, a mechanic begins by testing the battery for power. If the battery is charged, then she checks the starter motor. If the car still doesn't start, she looks over the fuel pump, and she continues in this manner until identifying the problem. Likewise, a scientist systematically attempts to eliminate hypotheses that do not explain a particular phenomenon. So that's kind of what scientists do. Okay. So the information that scientists collect during an experiment is known as data, or data. And the data are collected on the variables of the test, that is, any factors that can change in value under different conditions. And then there are two types of different variables, and I'm going to write them up here. Okay. So the first one is the independent variable. Does anybody know what an independent variable is?
Uh-oh. Independent is the one that you control and you change.
Yes. One whose value can be freely changed. So this is the one that scientists manipulate and change to compare to the one that doesn't change. So the second one, so independent variable changes. The second one is the dependent variable. So if the independent variable changes, what is the dependent variable?
Is that your result?
Yes. It is the result. It may or may not be influenced by changes in the independent variable, but the researcher can't change it. It stays the same, and it's what's affected by the independent variable, which changes. So it's kind of like the result, or how the independent variable affects what stays the same. So data the researchers collect should help them to eliminate certain things that do not support the hypothesis. In order for them to do this efficiently, they use controlled experiments, which are designed to eliminate as many alternative hypotheses as possible. So there are two different groups in a controlled experiment, and one group is the control group, and the second group is the experimental group. The control group stays the same, and the experimental group is the one that changes. So the control group would be the one, if a placebo was put into the experiment, the control group would have the placebo and nothing would change in that, and it would stay exactly the same. And then the experimental group would be the one that gets the actual drug and is changed. And so at the end of the experiment, the control group and the experimental group are compared to one another, and if there's a difference, then you know that the difference is due to the drug or whatever the researchers did to the experimental group. And then another part of a controlled experiment is random assignment. And Miri, can you explain what random assignment is?
Random assignment, that's when you randomly choose the people in your groups.
Right.
So that so you don't skew your results.
Right. Because if you go to one place and choose all the same people or all the same age group, then your results are going to get skewed, and it's not going to be an even distribution throughout the population, which is what you want to get in an experiment. So we also, in a controlled experiment, scientists also do something called a blind experiment, which means it's to prevent bias. Because if someone knows, say a patient that were receiving the drug, they know that they're receiving the drug, even though it's not affecting them, they may act like it's affecting them because they know that they're getting the drug. So we do a blind experiment to make sure that they don't know. And we also do what is called a double blind, which ensures that the researcher also doesn't know who is having the drug or the placebo. Because if the researcher knew, he could, when he was observing, he could skew his observations and have them influence his records and what he's observing, because he knows who has it. So our ideal, for scientists, an ideal experiment is a double-blind, a placebo controlled, a randomized experiment, and that represents the gold standard for medical research. However, well-controlled experiments can be difficult to perform when humans are the subjects, because a lot of times it can be unethical or stuff like that, so it's hard. So we use something called model systems. And model systems can be human cells that we use, or they can be animals instead of using actual people. So a lot of times we use rats or other rodents or monkeys or stuff like that instead of humans. So, and also in addition to a model system, we can use correlation to test hypotheses. And a correlation is a relationship between two variables. So I have a picture that demonstrates correlation. So in this picture, I don't know if you can really see, but over here is the percentage of subjects with colds, and over here is the amount of psychological stress you see, or they have. And as you see, the graph goes up, and so it shows the correlation is that the higher the stress they have, the more people will have colds. So even though this is it looks like it's proving, it's not. It's only a correlation, so you can't assume that stress causes you to have colds, because it's only a correlation. So I have a video about correlation that I want to play. Okay.
And remember, correlation does not imply causation.
Oh, that was the end. Okay.
Famous author Mark Twain once said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure, it just ain't so." Today's media throws us a whirlwind of information. Given that we lead busy lives, it's easy to take what we read at face value. In general, major news networks hire responsible journalists. However, occasionally misleading articles will still be published. One of the most common mistakes that journalists can make, particularly in the sciences, is to infer a causal relationship from a correlational study. Let me explain what I mean by using a fictional story. Imagine a king who rules over a vast country. Because the king is a kind king, he would like for all of his citizens to be as healthy as possible. He issues a survey to each town, asking for the number of doctors they have and the number of illnesses they've had that year. Upon receiving the survey back, he is shocked to find that the fewer doctors the town had, the fewer illnesses occurred. Wanting to have the healthiest population possible, he quickly orders that all towns with too many doctors get rid of half their doctors. Not surprisingly to us, this action does not decrease the illness in his kingdom, but actually increases it. But why? The king made the mistake that many journalists now make. He assumed that the number of doctors was causing the increase in illness, when in fact, the number of doctors was only related to, or correlated to, the number of illnesses in each town. Us being the intelligent individuals that we are, could likely guess that in fact, the relationship is reversed, and that when more illnesses are present, more doctors are needed to cure them, accounting for the higher number of doctors in the towns with the illnesses. You can see how the consequences of this type of mistake can often be detrimental. While the king's failure may seem obvious, we sometimes will overlook these issues when reading a misleading news article. A recent article published by Fox News presents misleading information about one of the most important things to us, our children. In a recent study, Dr. Angie Page looked at over 1,000 children ages 10 to 11. Her study looked at two main variables: how many hours they spent in front of a TV or computer screen every day, and the degree of psychological difficulty they had. The study found that children who spent more than 2 hours a day in front of screens were 60% more likely to have psychological difficulties than those who spent less than 2 hours a day. The article leads the reader to believe that spending time in front of the TV screen will cause a child to have psychological difficulty. However, Upon closer examination, we can see that this is not necessarily the case. We simply don't know which variable is causing tether. It could be the case that psychological difficulty leads to children spending longer time looking at screens, a possibility that the article fails to mention. There is also a third possibility that the article fails to entertain, the possibility that psychological difficulty and TV watching are both side effects of some other third variable. Perhaps children who are socially outcast have psychological difficulty because of this, and with no friends to play with, they end up spending lots of time watching TV. There are many third variables that might be at play here. The Fox News reporter fails to address these possibilities, and instead focuses on a more alluring causative relationship. As a consequence, many psychologically unhealthy children everywhere may come home after a tough day at school, only to find their TV unplugged. Next time you read a news article, consider these poor psychologically dysfunctional 10-year-olds deprived of the happiest moments of their day.
The end was kind of weird. Okay, so, as you can see from the video, correlation does not equal causation. And up here I put a little diagram. It says high stress and high cold frequency. So kind of like the graph, the graph that I showed you. This does not necessarily mean this, because this could be due to other illnesses, poor diet, little exercise, or little sleep, or a number of other variables. So correlation does not equal causation. So now for the statistics part. Statistics in science is a specialized branch of mathematics used to evaluate and compare data. So experimental groups test a small subgroup, a sample of the population, because obviously you're not going to go out and test the whole population. So they test a sample of the population, and then the statistical part of it is that the statistics extend the results from the sample to the entire population. So there's an example of this in the textbook, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, consider a hypothesis that the average hair length of women in college class in 1963 was shorter than the average hair length at the same college today. To test this hypothesis, we could compare a sample of snapshots from college yearbooks. If hairstyles were very similar among the women in a snapshot, you could reasonably assume that the average hair length in the college class is close to the average length in the snapshot. So they went back and compared two different pictures, or they took a picture from 1963, and they took the average hair lengths from there, and then through statistics found out what the average hair length for everybody would be by using that small subgroup of the population. So, okay. There are three different ways to evaluate scientific information. There are three different sources. So, the first is a primary source. So, what do you guys think a primary source is?
It's a source that comes directly from that person.
Right. So if I were a researcher, I would do my experiment, and then I'd write down my results and my hypothesis and my observations and my results and everything, and that would be a primary source. So primary source is from the researcher, and then it's also reviewed within the scientific community. And an example of a scientific source is a peer-reviewed research article in a journal. So, the second kind of way to evaluate scientific evidence is a secondary source. Secondary. So, if a primary source is that, then what is a secondary source?
A newspaper?
Yes!
Darn you, Jordan.
Perfect. So what we use, mostly what we as the general public use, is secondary source, because primary sources are often have a lot of scientific terms, and they're long and hard to read. And so as general public, what we mostly see are secondary sources. which can be books, newspapers, advertisements, stuff like that.